Looks like we're live.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our special research session that we're actually going to have Mike Colleta, who's the Manager of Research and Innovation at Phocuswright. Phocuswright, of course, is the world's largest and leading travel industry research authority. And we're also joined by Chen Weinsten, who has many titles, but one of them is he actually runs Travel Tech Nation in partnership with Phocuswright. But he's also an entrepreneur. He's a VC, and we'll share his story as well with Mike. And I just wanted to acknowledge that when we announced this conference, and we announced this conference to our audience, to the Travel Trends audience, and the Phocuswright team, who I've known for a long time, actually stepped forward to get involved. And so I just wanted to acknowledge the team, and I thought it was a terrific opportunity to bring our industry together and to be able to help advance all of these discussions. So I just wanted to recognize that, but then also kind of give the floor to Mike to share some of the latest research that Phocuswright has been working on, because I have to say, and I mentioned this when I interviewed Pete Como, that I found it so valuable when I got a Phocuswright license when I was way back at Lonely Planet, and I could build it into business cases. And that data and the research and analysis is so important to travel companies today. So take us through the work you've been doing to help everyone understand where we're at with AI, Mike.
Well, yeah, appreciate you saying that, and it's our pleasure to participate, and it has been great so far. Caught most of the sessions.
Awesome.
So here's my presentation. Yeah, so the first thing that I'd like to present is some of our AI-related research, and then I'm looking forward to discussing that and going deeper on the topic in various directions with you and Henry after. So Phocuswright does a lot of global consumer research where we survey travelers in various markets. So the first set of slides I'm going to show come from surveys done in the US, Canada, and major markets in Europe. And these are all fielded between May and August of last year. So we asked travelers various questions about their familiarity with and their use of generative AI for travel. So this first chart shows both familiarity on the bars, meaning they have at least heard of generative AI, and active usage on the blue line, meaning they've tried or used tools like ChatGPT or DALL-E. So we clearly see that both the highest familiarity with and use of generative AI is in the US, where just about 80% of travelers had at least heard of it, and 22% had tried or used it. We saw the lowest familiarity in the UK at 67%, but the lowest usage in France and Germany at 13% each. And both the UK and Italy right there also at 14% each. So maybe we can get into some of the possible reasons for these variations in the discussion, but in the interest of time, I want to keep moving along. Interestingly, looking at familiarity with generative AI by age, things skew in ways we might not expect. So for example, we found that while there aren't huge differences between age groups in the US, those 55 plus on the red bars actually showed the highest level of familiarity at 81%. And this was the inverse of Canada and all the European countries, where it topped with the youngest age group of 18 to 34 on the dark blue bars and declined from there. And then familiarity was highest overall among the youth in Spain in the 18 to 34 age group at 83% who said they're familiar, and lowest among 55 plus in the UK, where only 60% had heard of it. And then among those who are familiar with generative AI, those who said they'd be extremely or at least somewhat comfortable using it to plan a trip varies. It's highest in the US at 50%, much lower in Canada at 41%, and lowest in France and Germany at 30 and 35% respectively. And this is similar to what we saw with familiarity in those countries. So it makes sense that this follows. And also of those who are comfortable with planning a trip, looking at it by age, there's some interesting variations. In the US, it was the middle group of 35 to 54 on the light blue bars that said they were most comfortable at 58%. Most comfortable overall, just edging out the US, are again the youth in Spain, just like we saw earlier with familiarity, where 59% of them said they'd be comfortable planning a trip. And least comfortable are the older folks, 55 plus in Canada and France, both at 18% who said they'd be comfortable, and Germany also quite low at 24%. Then the other area where I wanted to share some of our research is what's happening with funding for travel startups, especially those who are specifically focused on AI. So at Phocuswright, we look at funding to travel companies by various vertical and horizontal categories. So here I'm showing a chart for horizontal categories, which is how we track companies based on the primary technology that they're using or the primary business model that they're operating under. So in this chart, we're looking at the share of total funding that has gone to companies in horizontal categories since 2018. And the bottom section of the chart in dark gray represents companies in the booking horizontal, which have historically taken the largest share of funding dollars, because this category represents mainly transactional business-to-consumer booking platforms, which typically raise a lot of money for technology and marketing. But interestingly, the booking category is on the decline since 2018, as funding has diversified into what investors see as more interesting or fertile categories. And really interestingly, in 2023, it was for the first time outpaced by all the other categories. So that's the bluish section on the chart. What I did for simplicity was combine all the companies, all the funding to all the companies in about 20 of the other horizontal categories that we track, in order to show how funding to horizontals besides booking is growing. And it was a huge year last year for all those other categories, where they captured the majority of funding for the first time in our history of tracking. It's usually the booking category captures 50% plus of funding, but all the others jumped to 58%. That's not including AI plus data, which I'll talk about, but showing, as I mentioned, that funding is greatly diversifying in recent years. So what I really want to highlight is the AI plus data category in turquoise at the top. And a quick explainer, lots of companies are using AI, but again, per our definition, these would be the ones where we identified AI as a primary technology that they're using, or that they're basing their primary business model around AI. So we see funding has been ticking up a bit every year since 2018, when it was at 1%, and then it jumped to 5% in 2023. So funding to AI and data companies in travel is picking up, but hasn't exploded yet or anything. Although to jump to 5% last year was a good sign, given that it was very much a weak year overall for funding. So my perspective is that travel is notoriously slow to invest in new technologies, still arguably lagging in investing in mobile in a lot of ways. So we're not seeing a huge funding spike yet for AI in terms of venture dollars, at least. There's a lot of internal investment going on for sure. But it's possible that generative AI could help kick off a larger investment cycle sooner than later. And then for some kind of additional context, I wanted to share some news stories and a video that I think will add some good context to some of these stats and help frame our discussion. So this first screenshot is an article from The Information from the end of last year, and highlighting how much funding had slowed down already for AI-focused companies compared to a year ago. I highlighted the part here that says some young startups have struggled to close rounds investors would have jumped to win a year ago. So that is part of the dynamic at play when it comes to funding. Seems to be tightening already. And then something I'd like to discuss with Dan and Henry is autonomous agents. And I wanted to point out how whenever people outside the travel industry talk about autonomous agents, and even talking about AI in general, they just can't seem to help giving travel examples. So this is an article from just a couple of weeks ago discussing the announcement from OpenAI that they're working on autonomous agents. And I highlighted the part where travel planning and booking is the one example they gave of what it could do with web-based tasks. So travel is one of the top potential use cases on a lot of people's radars, even outside the industry, and expectations are high for automation to really take hold. And then the other thing that would be great to discuss is what the real impact of AI on jobs could be. I admit I'm maybe a little bit more of a pessimist here than most people, but I think it's prudent to plan for worst case scenarios. So this is an article from Bloomberg, which is also published just a few weeks ago, about layoffs that have been specifically attributed to being related to AI and announced that way. So the takeaway is that according to this, companies are laying off more workers already than they want to admit. And we all mostly talk about AI in terms of software, but humanoid robots are coming, obviously powered by AI, and could impact a lot of jobs too, especially in hospitality for tasks such as cooking and cleaning. So this is a 45-second video I thought was worth showing because it does a really good job of highlighting what the latest robots are now capable. Yeah, so that's pretty mind-blowing to me. And then in closing, here's something Elon Musk said late last year. And whatever you think of him at the moment, I think most people have to admit he's been able to see the future pretty well. Even though, as Gilad mentioned in his session about an hour ago, maybe we have to take a lot of what he says with a grain of salt. I get that. But he basically said he thinks AI will take all jobs eventually. And I think the bottom line is that no one knows. But I like to plan for worst and best case scenarios, like I said. So I highlighted the bottom part here about how in that scenario, people would focus on meaning in life. And for a lot of people, that means travel. So this is getting a little out there, but I wanted to end on a positive note that there are some large and complicated questions to be answered in the long run, but it could be really good for our industry if, because of AI, people have lots more free time to travel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm glad you opened that door because it's certainly top of mind for many people understanding what it means for them and specifically their roles. And we've even seen companies that have actually gotten rid of entire marketing departments in place of leveraging AI. So it is a very real phenomenon. The part I'd love to ask you two questions on, and then we'll bring Henry into the conversation. The first is on the data. So going back to the slides you shared with the differences, and I always find this fascinating for global businesses when you're trying to identify where there's opportunities to grow your market. And it's often difficult to separate the signal from the noise and on where a significant opportunity exists. So when we looked at those stats, USA, Canada, Europe, and the differences between the age breakdown and their engagement with ChatGPT, what really stands out to you? Where do you think the opportunities are for a younger demographic, an older demographic? And I guess how much of that can we act on?
Yeah, I guess the key would be just to understand what's happening in those various markets, which we don't dig too deep into, but there's certainly some cultural reasons for the differences you see in familiarity with and use of generative AI. And that could just be attitudes towards technology within the culture. Could be a matter of how much the media have covered the launch, and developments of ChatGPT and related tools. There was I think a brief period last year in Italy where they temporarily banned ChatGPT, and they brought it back. And then even local laws like Germany, was lower in some of those charts, and they have some more strict laws about data usage, which may have the effect of making people more cautious about technologies. And it's something we plan to dig into more over time to understand better. But yeah, I'd say that's the key, just understanding what's really happening in those markets, so you can kind of plan accordingly.
Thanks for that. The other one I want to go back to, of course, is the startup funding. And there's a colleague of mine named Jordan Jacobs who runs a very successful VC fund called Radical Ventures. And they have $1 billion under management. They've invested in companies like Cohere, which happens to be based here in Toronto as well. There's obviously a real AI talent base here in the city. And that business is already worth 2 billion. He's convinced it's going to be worth 200 billion. There's some really exciting things happening in the AI investment space, but not as much in travel. They don't invest in travel yet. And it's part of not only the theme of this conference. We talked at the beginning about how massive the travel industry is and how significant the technology is, and bringing those two together. We had Acai obviously joined earlier, one of the AI startups that's been acquired. But one of the things that certainly keeps coming up, and I can say this from my experience too, in talking to VCs, we were pitching our mytravelalert.com as a good example, which I think is a terrific concept. And I think what we're building there will be unique. But the challenge from VCs is, why don't incumbents just do this? Why doesn't Expedia just introduce this? And so that's some of the feedback. And I guess that's what I wanted to ask you is, like, when we look at the stat you just shared on startup funding, do you think, I guess, like, your prediction will start to really take off at some point? What is your view? Because it clearly hasn't exploded yet.
Yeah. I showed that article about how it seems to already be getting harder, because it's that's just typically how it goes. I think with anything new like this, people get excited and throw money at the wall and see what sticks first. But yeah, I guess the discussion there, you kind of touched on earlier from one of the startup panel that I was watching, might come down to, who has advantages here? Is it big companies or is it startups? I'll always say that startups have the advantage in that you just never know what is going to come out of them. I mean, the biggest startups, most successful, have often been ideas that nobody saw coming. The best one in travel is probably Airbnb. Nobody thought it could be successful, but here we are.
Yeah.
And exactly. That's sort of the allure. Yeah, that's sort of the allure, the magic of startups, and what everybody loves about them, that unknown factor. I think you can't ignore that when it comes to AI, it favors big companies in that it's all about data, which they have. There'll always be niche use cases for startups, for sure, and startups will exceed there. But I do think big companies have learned to operate more like startups, even at huge scale. And they understand more the value and even necessity of cannibalizing their own businesses before someone else does it for them, and how to stay ahead in that way. Yeah. But they do have unavoidable bureaucracy, absolutely, and that always leaves the door open for startups. So I think short answer, startups that really figure out creative and promising uses of AI will always get funding. It's true with any new tech. Generally, that means doing things that other companies can't do. That might mean having data that other companies don't have. But those are always the ones that do best and will continue to raise money. And I do see that happening more on the B2B side. Applications, in use for B2B oriented companies, helping other travel companies implement AI, than on the business to consumer side, because building a consumer brand is just so difficult.
Yeah. Well, just on that topic, let's bring Henry into this conversation, because not only is he a successful entrepreneur, and you're in New Jersey, Henry's in Tel Aviv. So it's great to have a few people joining from Israel today. And I guess you have a unique view on this, because from your perspective, obviously there is a massive growth in AI startups. And one of the things that I know that you were keen to discuss was actually how they differentiate themselves. And right. There's a lot of startups attending this. So advice for founders. So where do you see the investment environment now for travel AI startups? And what would be your advice to those founders listening to this?
It's a good question. Well, first, I wanna mention Mike's research. I think it, for someone from on the outside, it can look surprising, right? That AI is not taking a bigger chunk in terms of travel funding. But to me, it makes perfect sense. This is because AI is just another tool, realistically speaking, right, for startups to try and create value. And historically speaking, travel has always been an, let's say, underrepresented industry in comparison to size. So AI didn't really make any difference. Also, there was this issue where there was the AI explosion, more or less, right? Somewhere around Q3 last year, where, everyone was trying to get a bite out of an AI company with a relatively low bar. Now, especially the tier 1 VCs, tier 2 VCs, they've seen so much. Now it's they're looking for proofs, right? They're not interested in another wrapper around an AI LLM. They're looking for something that really creates value, that has real adoption, that really can set a new bar. So AI is kind of normalizing. I think AI would become bigger on that slide, but it would not like overwhelm everything else, and definitely not quickly, because still travel is one of those areas where investors that are outside of the space don't understand it at early stages. Now, in terms of what should a founder do, that's exactly it. I mean, right now, AI helps you build a company faster, realistically speaking, with relatively low efforts, if you know what you're doing. And this is how you differentiate. You have a lot of people who understand the new innovation in AI, but they don't understand the domain that they're going after. And this is how you'll separate the interesting companies that have real value potential and the ones who are just another wrapper and like everyone else. And AI is kind of like, so NFX, the fund NFX, they mentioned that their view of AI is kind of like water, right? Water is everywhere. It doesn't matter where you drink it from; it's the same. But still, you can buy water in different bottles, and some bottles cost more than others, right? So, realistically speaking, if you know how to package it correctly, if you know how to orchestrate the different kinds of AI to solve sophisticated problems, you can create something really, really interesting. To me personally, this is why I co-founded Acai Travel, because I think it is underrepresented, and we do need to find and solve something meaningful. So just another day, essentially an ops manager in a TMC advised us that she estimated that almost 8 hours per day is spent on just one task alone every day, and by relatively senior people that are spending 2 to 2.5 hours per day. And this is just one use case that can solve, if you look at it at scale, millions for one of these companies. So I think in that regard, it has a lot of opportunity. In terms of what you mentioned around layoffs, I think, our mantra is around, the mantra is human with AI will replace the human without AI to begin with. Right. So the products we build, for example, at Acai are essentially aimed at helping the agent's best friend to begin with. At the moment, there's a huge shortage of agents and there's a wage inflation. It's kind of like the perfect storm, right? I mean, and you have companies that have been historically reluctant to adopt automation and new technologies because their business model relied on the human service. But post-COVID, that's out the window. I mean, they now need to scramble for EBITDA.
Yeah.
So if you know what you're doing, you can really create a meaningful, interesting opportunity. And AI kind of removes the awful part of being a travel agent and kind of makes it into a more fun job, which what it used to be in the past.
For sure.
And there are other things you can do with it, but yeah, just my point of view.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where kind of the cutoff is, if there is one, in terms of like you're automating work, which is great, making people more efficient, but like where does that end? In that, as AI gets more capable, you're going to continue to do that. So, at what point, like, does the person go away?
It's interesting. It's interesting. Well, first of all, I think we've, for decades, we've been talking about the automated agent, right? Agents will die out. We always said that, like, for years. I've been investing in travel for a decade. It's one of the early things that we talked about. I don't think we are at that point. But if you look at, I don't know, the movie industry, right, where AI started with LLMs and ChatGPT, and they were thinking, okay, copywriters are not going to have a job anymore, right? Or screenwriters are not going to have a job anymore. And now with this new innovation coming out of these companies, now they're making the videos. So now it's not, so now it's actually the studio that's out of work, right? Not the actual screenwriter. But in my view, actually, the screenwriter is the big winner here, because now that's how you're going to differentiate. With quality content and direction, you can now eliminate everything in between you and the consumer, or the spectator, or whatever. So I think as AI evolves, I think people who can take advantage will have a meaningful opportunity. I don't see us 100% automated, because in the end of the day, AI is not mature enough to do that. Maybe in a decade. People are not gonna use a product that 5% of the time sends them to the wrong place or gives them the wrong answer, even if it's just 5% of the time. So I think we're a bit further along than what people think, but people will need to adjust. I agree with this comment.
Yeah, good point about
We're-
traditional travel agents. I mean, they did make a strong comeback since the pandemic as people realized the value of a human agent who has unique knowledge of the destination, the cruise ship, et cetera. So you have those two things kind of colliding.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you guys one final question. We're just run out of time, but the one thing I wanted to leave everyone with is your views on where AI is going in 2024. And I specifically, obviously, wanted to ask that question of Henry first, just, how you're envisioning the potential for AI and what travel providers should be considering when entering into this new arena.
Yeah, well, I think the I kind of said what I kind of answered it to begin with, but I'll add another layer to this question. I think in travel overall, a lot of these different parts in travel have been already evolving through technology. So the booking stage and a lot of these areas have been kind of propelled technologically, and some areas are completely neglected because they just require a super deep domain expertise like customer service in travel, which is super difficult. This is why companies like Amazon have steered clear from this area, and why companies like Chase and JP Morgan are going into this area, but they need to acquire other entities because it's super hard to do. I think that piece today with the current technology, if you know what you're doing, and this is kind of what we're going after with Acai, is to enable that to be the operating system for travel operations, so that anyone who has like a large consumer base can actually go and start selling travel, and the difficult part, which is the operational, the service part, can be solved. So I think that's kind of where we were going in travel anyway.
That's great. Thank you. And I appreciate you mentioning that again, actually reinforcing operational efficiencies, because that's certainly come up in the chat. And that is the two areas of focus. Shane referenced that, and we're moving into this afternoon session now that's all about customer service and the guest experience. So Mike, you've got a lot of other projects. You've got other events coming up this year. Any other last views from you on where AI is headed in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I did want to say that I do think everybody needs to be looking at how to use AI in their own roles. I think that's probably why you're attending this conference. But, that should be a focus for everyone this year. I do see it like learning to use Excel in the late 80s, or the how to use the internet in the early 90s. It's a skill that just is going to put you ahead of the pack at this point. And then I think the thing to watch this year is going to be autonomous agents. OpenAI is now placing some specific emphasis on them. And it has implications, I think, for how travel is shopped for and booked, as well as automation on the back end. I showed that one article about autonomous agents and how travel is always one of the main examples, right? Because it seems to be an obvious application to like the general public. I don't think it's that obvious because travel is complicated. Lots of people will like to plan and book their trips manually for a long time. There's a lot of talk about how the problem is that people like to visit 30 plus sites or need to visit 30 plus sites to plan their trip. And that is, a big problem, but people enjoy that part of the process. So I think we'll start to see this year, where can autonomous agents do some of the lifting at least, maybe the more mundane parts, certainly help with research, gathering information. It's already doing that. But then maybe even booking it for you. You need to develop some trust that it can do that. But the idea that it might be able to, maybe not this year, but eventually, act like a person, go and log in, create an account and log into a membership site that might have, a special rate on a hotel, and find that rate that you wouldn't get through Kayak or one of the kind of public meta search companies, for it to be able to do things like that are really high value. And that's high value automation. Maybe it may come this year or soon, but that's where I see things going. So yeah, that's the main thing to watch this year. How autonomous agents evolve and make travel planning smarter, as well as back-end operations.
That's great. Fascinating insights from both of you. Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you, Mike, for being a part of this. And make sure you follow up with them and keep track of what they're working on. And we'll see you on a future episode of Travel Trends for sure. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.